Hey guys, how is it going? So I think Pine Creek is still streaming, and I wasn't even able to listen to it because I was doing Greek verb paradigm drills, right? Like if you've ever done ancient Greek, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Didome, didhome, uh, histeme, hieme, right? But I actually finished a notebook today, so all of this is filled with ancient Greek. I already started another one. Yeah, but anyway, let's give out pine points. Um, Someone asked me when's a good time to comment because sometimes the comments just delete themselves, before the stream goes online, and I have no idea. So I think it's a good idea, like an hour or a couple of minutes before the stream starts, just place your comments, and you have to just do it over and over, in case they get deleted. But this time, 1,000 pine points to Greyback. Let me actually switch to my official ledger. Greyback. There you go. Roman, of course, with 500 pine points. And then we have a new guy, it seems. There we go. So that takes care of that. And I was originally supposed to talk about Richard Bauckham, and specifically about an argument which he published in his books Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is one of the few, I would say, publications in forever actively putting forward arguments in favor of the hypothesis that the four canonical gospels are actually based in eyewitness testimony. And there are other, like, couple of different arguments that he puts forward. And one of them is basically he noticed that the distribution of proper names in the gospels and acts is pretty close to a distribution of Jewish male names in antiquity. And he thinks that this is very unexpected on the hypothesis that a lot of the gospel material is fictional or fictitious, and on the hypothesis that the people in question didn't exist, that they are fictional characters. And when I was doing prep for my video, I actually discovered like additional things that are wrong with the argument on top of what I've been talking about on YouTube before. So if you actually go to some of the older videos, there's particular one when me and Pine Creek review Mike Winger giving a sermon on the Gospel of Mark, and he basically reproduces Bockham's argument. And I go over some points why what Bockham's saying isn't actually evidence for the traditional authorship, right? So you can watch that. But yeah, just like yesterday, I found out more things that are wrong with it. And so much so that I actually contacted one of my professors, and we agreed it would be best for me to just write a peer-reviewed article. So I'm going to do that and see if I can get that published, because there have been a lot of people responding to Bauckham, but to my knowledge, they didn't really raise the objections that I identified, probably because biblical scholars, including Bauckham, don't really have training in statistics, so they don't appreciate the failures of the argument on the statistical front, right? But I do have some training in statistics because I, studied political science. So hopefully I can contribute a nice multidisciplinary study on that. But that means I won't be able to talk about it here, unfortunately, because when you decide to write a peer-reviewed journal article, the last thing that you want to do is to talk about it to random people on the internet, because there's always a chance that someone's going to hear it and steal your idea. Is it very likely? No. but I'm just taking a Pascal's wager on this, and I just don't want to risk it, right? Even though the probability is very, very low, the world is a small place, and there is no shortage of coincidences. So I decided to switch topics last minute and talk about the best prophecy in the Bible. So, do you know how people like McDillahanty? So, if you imagine a Christian calls into the atheist experience and starts talking about Jesus fulfilling 400 different Old Testament prophecies, right? I think we've all seen the clips of these kinds of calls. So, what's the first thing that Matt Dillahunty raises as an objection to biblical prophecies in general? Well, he goes after lack of specificity. He points out that in a lot of these cases, the prophecy doesn't really specify when it's going to be fulfilled, who is going to fulfill it, and it's usually pretty vague on details. And the fulfillment, like, very often depends on specific wording, which can be interpreted in a number of different ways, right? So it's never really clear cut, like this person is going to do this, is going to go there, meet these people, and this is how it's going to end, right? It's usually pretty vague. But there is actually at least one massive exception in the Bible, and that's an amazing, extremely detailed, extremely rich, and historically precise biblical prophecy. And I want to show you guys what it is. It actually takes an entire chapter in the book of Daniel. And I'm, of course, talking about Daniel chapter 11, right? So it's a prophecy that Daniel receives, the supposed author of the book. And it describes events after his, like, centuries after his own time, right? So we are just going to go through that, and I will show you using secular history how this prophecy was fulfilled. And then there's going to be a massive twist. We are going to be talking about it, how having this amazing prophecy in the Bible actually, very paradoxically, works against its favor. So I think we are all going to have an amazing time. But before I do that, actually, this is a great quote that I found in Richard Bauckham when I was rereading some of his stuff a couple of days ago. So in some of the last streams, I was talking about traditional gospel authorship, and I pointed out that when it comes to some of the canonical gospels, particularly the Gospel of Matthew, there isn't really anyone defending the Matthew, the apostle, the tax collector, personally handpicked by Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, as the actual author of the Gospel of Matthew. Even very conservative, evangelical Christian scholars like Mike Lacona, for example, have given up on that authorship, and they are basically dismissing everything that every ancient Christian author said about the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, right? Because every single author who says anything about who the author of the Gospel of Matthew, who this Matthew was, identifies him as the apostle, Matthew the apostle, right? And now these evangelical scholars are just throwing that out, all of this, like, amazing, valuable historical material, right? And this includes Richard Bauckham. So it might be a bit shocking that one of the few guys that actually puts forward positive arguments for the Gospels being rooted in eyewitness testimony actually doesn't think that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew. And why doesn't he think that? Well, because on this occasion he's being a good historian, right? He's talking about a specific issue, which are the different lists of apostles, right? So there are two different lists of apostles with different names. There is overlap, but there are differences. One list is found in Mark and Matthew, so that's obviously copied from Matthew. Obviously copies it from Mark, and the other list is found in the Gospel of Luke. And the question is why there are differences, right? And the way how to harmonize it, usually, that's how apologists normally do that, is to say that, Well, actually, it's the same 12 people. They just have multiple different names. Like there are individuals who had more than one names. So really, when you are harmonizing, right? Like if you ever found yourself harmonizing something, maybe you harmonized Plutarch, maybe you want to harmonize the Book of Mormon, maybe you want to harmonize the Quran, right? So anytime you are faced with an apparent contradiction involving names of people, here's how you do it, right? So if you need two different people to be the same person, you just say that it's one person with multiple different names, right? So you can actually merge two different characters together. And if you want to make one person into two different people, for example, because contradictory actions are ascribed to the same person in different sources, well, you just say there were two different people with the same name, right? And they just happened to share some similarities. Maybe they lived in the same area and they interacted with the same people. But of course, it was a different person, right? That's no contradiction. This is how you do it. And I think this is what apologists should do with the different dates of the crucifixion in the synoptic tradition and in the Gospel of John, right? They should just say that actually there were two Jesuses. One of them was crucified on the day of the Passover, and the other one was crucified the day after. Um, hey, that could happen, right? That's entirely possible. So why not? So Bauckham is talking about the two different lists, right? And he notices that in this case, the harmonization doesn't really work because it's massively historically implausible. Now, normally, it wouldn't stop any good, humble, pious, faithful Christian apologist because usually they don't really care about plausibility. As long as you can make it fit, doesn't really matter how far-fetched it is, as long as it's like logically possible, as long as there isn't like, as long as the harmonization doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction, they will just take it. And it doesn't matter what like historical implausibilities they will have to put in into the harmonization in order to make it work. But Richard Bauckham isn't really thinking like that, probably because he wants to still keep like publishing in academia, right? So he needs to at least use the historical method a little bit. So he recognizes that when it comes to these different names, this harmonization isn't going to work. Why is that? Well, because we know that the harmonization would require the same person to have multiple Jewish names. But that's completely unprecedented, right? Like we don't have anyone actually, as far as I know, that would be in the historical record as having two different Jewish names, like using two different Jewish names at the same time. Now, there were Jews who used a Jewish name and then either a Greek or a Latin name. That's very well attested. But we don't really have any examples of Jews, using two different Jewish names, which is what would be required here. So he says the most plausible explanation of the occurrence of the name Matthew in 9:9 is that the author of the gospel, knowing that Matthew was a tax collector and wishing to narrate the call of Matthew in the gospel that was associated with him, but not knowing the story of Matthew's call, transferred Mark's story from Levi to Matthew. So here we have Richard Bauckham essentially saying, look, in the Gospel of Mark, there is, of course, the call to Levi. And in the Gospel of Matthew, there is the same story. And just the name Levi is replaced with the name Matthew. Now, any good Christian apologist like Timothy McGrew or Lydia McGrew, they would just say, well, there was just this guy who was named Matthew Levi, right? What's the problem? Well, Bauckham realizes that this is massively implausible because that would require this naming convention to be the case, which we don't have attested, right? And if there were Jews running around with multiple Jewish names, we would know about it. So this is actually deafening silence, right? Because we have such a wealth of material. So he thinks, okay, this is not very plausible. So he's forced to concede that the author of the Gospel of Matthew wasn't Matthew, first of all, and he didn't really know how the call of Matthew went down. So what he did instead, he took an existing story of the Gospel of Mark and just changed the names and copied it because he wanted to narrate a call of a different person, right? And just if you think about it, the implications of him saying it are completely mind-blowing. So first of all, was the author being deceptive when he did that? Was he lying essentially? Because he altered the facts, right? He took a story and he just copied it, but made the story about a different person. Was his audience okay with it? You know, the first Christians that the Gospel of Matthew was originally read to? Or was there anyone who could debunk it? You know, was there an eyewitness to the call of Matthew who could raise his hand and say, wait a minute, this is not how it went down. You are bearing a false witness. You need to repent right now. Well, apparently no, right? Richard Bauckham doesn't think that. He thinks that this was acceptable. And that's why, you know, we still have the Gospel of Matthew today. Because either they were no eyewitnesses to call this out, or people just didn't really care. They understood that this is normal literary practice, and it was completely acceptable, and people had no problem with it. So that's really interesting, right? Like, I always find it super, super spicy when you get these kinds of concessions, these kinds of admissions from even very conservative evangelical scholars, right? And Bauckham goes on to say, if this explanation of the name Matthew in Matthew 9:9 is correct, it has one significant implication, that the author of Matthew's Gospel intended to associate the Gospel with the Apostle Matthew, but was not himself the Apostle Matthew. Well, no shit, Sherlock, right? Matthew himself could have described his own call without having to take over the way Mark described Levi's call. Well, this is exactly what I'm saying as well, right? Like, one of the strongest arguments against the traditional authorship in case of the Gospel of Matthew is that why is it the case that this author, who supposedly narrates events that he himself was present at, has to rely on essentially rewriting, tweaking the Gospel of Mark instead of just sitting down and writing an original story? You know, like I've showed you guys at least 2 times examples of the Gospel of Mark in one column and the Gospel of Matthew in second column, and how there are entire sentences essentially that are exactly identical. You know, so this is actually massively unexpected, and we don't see any other author in antiquity doing that. You know, we have examples of historians, especially in late antiquity, who essentially just copy segments of previous works, and they are creating just compilations, right? They are compiling previous sources, so there are strong word-for-word agreements. But these historians were not eyewitnesses. They were usually narrating events that took place hundreds and hundreds of years before their own time. So they just, you know, took a historian that already wrote about it. They took like 5 of them, put them together, and that created like a new historical account, right? But we don't really have any examples of that when it comes to eyewitnesses. So yeah, this is actually massively unexpected, and Bauckham realizes that, right? Like, he thinks, obviously, if the author was the apostle, he would just narrate his own call, right? He wouldn't have to copy the call of a different person from a different gospel, not written by an eyewitness, right? Supposedly. So I just find it super interesting. So here's your 20 minutes of Richard Bauckham goodness, and stay tuned for my article that will be probably published like 3 years from now, you know? But one of these days, when it's out, we will get to talk about it, and that's going to be pretty awesome. But let's actually get to the main feature of today's presentation. For those of you who came late, maybe from Pine Creek's channel, I'm going to show you guys the best biblical prophecy. It talks about very specifically about specific people. It gives very specific descriptions of events. It's amazingly detailed. It goes on for an entire chapter in the book of Daniel. And we just have it confirmed by secular history, don't you know, right? So it's really amazing. It's not like these, oh, then I saw a goat with 7 horns, and each horn had like 5 eyes and 7 crowns, and then there was a dragon, and he swallowed the horn, and he pooped a sheep and a goat and stuff like that, right? Nothing like this. This is amazing. This is absolutely amazing stuff. So let's start in Daniel chapter 11, verse 1 to 2. And this is the beginning of the prophecy of a vision that Daniel receives. Now I will announce the truth to you. This is a divine messenger speaking. 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through the riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. So now I will just start laying down how this prophecy is being actually fulfilled in history, in secular history, right? And at first you are going to say, well, of course, you could find all kinds of examples that match that throughout world history, right? Okay, we have 3 kings who will arise in Persia. Well, how many Persian kings there were there? Like probably over 100, right? If you count the various Persian empires, and maybe you can throw in the Ottomans as well, right? They controlled the Middle and Near East, right? So nothing amazing, but I will keep going, right? And let's actually see at what point you will start realizing, hold on, there is something going on here. This can't just be coincidence, right? You can't actually just look at world history and just find a random set of events and people who correspond to it. This is actually genuine prophecy being fulfilled, right? So 3 more kings. That would be Cambyses II, Pseudo-Smerdis, who was an impostor pretending to be Cambyses's brother, who actually seized the throne but then was ousted. And of course, Darius I, who ruled over Persia. And then Xerxes, there was of course Xerxes II, who, if you didn't know about it, was like a really tall, bald guy made out of gold, who invaded Greece. And we all know the story, right? So this is how it starts. Then a warrior king shall rise, who shall rule with great dominion and take action as he pleases. And while still rising in power, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to the dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted and go to others. Well, what happened, right, after Xerxes I? Well, after a while, there was, of course, Alexander the Great, who conquered Persia. But his empire was not actually inherited by his children, right? Like, for example, by Alexander IV. But after he died, the various, let's say, legitimate claimants were assassinated because I guess he didn't really have a very good spy master, and his wife didn't really have a very good intrigue. So the plot power was completely through the roof, right? And Alexander IV was just exploded in manure, which is not true, by the way. Yeah. And as we all know, the realm of Alexander the Great was actually divided into, well, there was originally like 20 people who actually tried to grab either the throne or at least some of the territory, but they were eventually nailed down to 4. So we have the Seleucids, of course, after Seleucus I. We have the Ptolemid, after Ptolemaeus I. We have the Antigonid, after Antigonos. And we have Lysimachus, of course, and his realm really didn't survive his reign. But these are the 4 principal Diadochi, the generals, the let's say followers, disciples of Alexander the Great, who eventually ended up abandoning the idea that one of them can control the entire realm, and they, one after another, just declared themselves to be Basileus, king, and they just ruled a part of the empire, and it nicely corresponds to 4 cardinal directions, right? So we have the Seleucid Empire in the east, of course, in Persia, Media. We have the Ptolemite Egypt, We have Antigonids who ruled in the west, particularly in Macedon, and they exerted influence over Greece. And then we have Lysimachus kind of in the north, in Thrace, and in Western Asia Minor. So let's go on, right? Sounds amazing. Are you impressed? I'm already starting to have some sweat. Not necessarily because this is amazing prophecy, but because I actually turned the heat on, and maybe I'll need to change it again. So yeah, let's get back to it. And now your mind is just going to be completely blown, right, by this. So then the king of the south shall grow strong, but one of his officers shall grow stronger than he, and shall rule a realm greater than his own. After some years, they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to ratify the agreement. So this is, of course, describing making alliances in Crusader Kings, which is accomplished by establishing familial ties. So a peace agreement or alliance, a political pact, would normally in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages be ratified by just people like the families marrying basically into each other. It's a way how to exchange hostages essentially, right? So if one of the parties was to break agreement, then their family members would essentially be in trouble because they would find themselves in the territory of the enemy. But she shall not retain her power, and his offspring shall not endure. She shall be given up, she and her attendants, and her child, and the one who supported her. So what happened after Diadochi partitioned the realm of Alexander the Great? Well, Seleucus the first Nicator, meaning the victor, was originally one of the generals. He was actually an admiral under Ptolemy, who already established himself to be a king in Egypt, known as Ptolemy the First Soter, which means the savior. And he actually managed to conquer the eastern provinces of the former empire of the Alexander the Great. But instead of remaining loyal to Ptolemaeus, he actually established himself as a king. And his realm was much, much larger than Ptolemaic Egypt. So this corresponds nicely, right? It was larger when it comes to the area, but a lot of that was just empty space, right? And if you follow contemporary politics, you know, of course, that like land area isn't as important as people and these kinds of things, right? So they eventually signed a peace agreement, essentially an alliance, and Berenike, daughter of Ptolemy II, Adelphos, married Antiochus II Theos. So after the two kings died, there was this marriage tie between their successors in Egypt and in Syria, primarily in the Seleucid Empire, in order to secure an alliance between the two kingdoms, right? And this was specifically after the Second Syrian War. There will be 6 Syrian wars mentioned here. So yeah, if you don't have a map in front of you, well, the Ptolemies were obviously reigning from Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire had its heartland in Syria, and to a lesser extent Mesopotamia, right? It changed over time. And what's in between those regions were, of course, Palestine, right? So really, there was a lot of wars specifically for Palestine and for Syria as well. So there are these so-called 6 Syrian wars. And by the way, all of those kings are going to, in between them, have like 3 different names, right? So in the Ptolemies, the king is always going to be named Ptolemaeus, and on the Seleucid side, it's going to be either Seleucus or Antiochus. So actually, like Hellenistic history of the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most difficult part of like doing a degree in ancient history, because you have like 50 different people who have just 5 names, right? And luckily they have these titles. They already existed. Like those titles were already used in the ancient times because historians needed to differentiate those people, right? Numerals actually come from modern history. That wasn't really a thing in antiquity. But like memorizing that, like who did what and in which like Syrian war out of the 7 or 8 was like which battle is yeah, it's not difficult. It's not as bad as Greek verb drills, right? But it's up there. So yeah, so that was this marriage to secure this alliance. And Berenike, I should say, tried to press a royal claim of Ptolemy's infant grandson, so her own son. But she failed, and basically the whole family got massacred, right? So she, her son, and even her father ended up assassinated, which is exactly what Daniel says, right? So already we have multiple different people doing very specific things, arranging marriages, being assassinated with their offsprings, right? So that can't be coincidence. We are already getting to a point where this can't just randomly line up, right? There needs to be something behind it. There needs to be a source of information. So let's keep going. By the way, I'm going to cover like I think 30 verses, and we are at verse number 9. And already this is amazing, right? This is much better than those prophecies that Christian scholars bring up to Matt Dillahunty that he just dismisses, right? Because they're vague and it can be interpreted in all kinds of different ways. This is just on a completely different level, and I can guarantee that probably 99% of Christians have no idea this is even in their own Bible. That you can take the book of Daniel in one hand, and you can take secular history like Polybius, for example, in the other hand, or the books of Maccabees, and you can just compare it and it lines up perfectly, right? So let's go on. In those times, and by the way, this is Daniel, of course, receiving a prophetic vision like hundreds and hundreds of years before these events took place, right? You have to realize this, right? This isn't like Book of Kings or Chronicles, where it's just narrated by a historian afterwards, right? This is actually predicted in advance. So in those times, a branch from her roots, meaning Berenike, shall rise up in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall take action against them and prevail. Even their gods, with their idols and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, he shall carry off to Egypt as spoils of war. For some years, he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall invade the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. So, what is this talking about? Well, Berenike's brother, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, avenged his family and invaded the Seleucid Empire, which now was under Seleucus II in the Third Syrian War. And he plundered the empire. He brought loot and captives back to Egypt. And Seleucus II, of course, in retaliation, invades Egypt, but he's repelled, which is exactly what this says, right? A branch from her roots. So if you imagine like a family tree, and Berenica is here, and her kind of line is cut off, well, there is a different branch going from the same root, and that's her brother Ptolemy III, right? Lines up perfectly. Amazing stuff, right? Like you don't find this anywhere else in. Actually, I will show you later where you can also find these amazing prophecies in the ancient literature, right? So this is not quite unprecedented. Pagans had that as well. They arguably had even better prophecies because those actually mentioned specifically names, not just the king of the north, but Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and stuff like that. But let's go on through Daniel. Let me check the chat. Let's see if everything is okay. Okay, cool. So his sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall advance like a flood and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Moved with rage, the king of the south shall go out and do battle against the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, which shall, however, be defeated by his enemy. When the multitude has been carried off, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall overthrow tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again rise, a multitude larger than the former, and after some years he shall advance with a great army and abundant supplies. So what this is describing is, of course, Seleucus III and Antiochus III the Great, arguably the greatest Seleucid leader after um Antiochus the First. Sorry, Seleucus the First. So those guys actually prepare another invasion of Egypt, and Antiochus the Third is actually the guy who carries it out, right? So this is the fourth Syrian war, in case you were counting. So take a shot every time there's a Syrian war, and you will have about two more shots, but still. But he eventually defeats, here, Daniel is, of course, describing, or division, let's say, is describing the various peripeties of the war. But eventually, Antiochus III is defeated at the Battle of Raphia. And by the way, I've seen Floyd FP in the chat pointing out that the Book of Daniel was actually written in the 2nd century, like centuries after these events took place, or these decades after these centuries took place, right? Well, don't spoil it, but I will, in the end of the presentation, show you guys how this being in the Bible, actually ends up working against his favor. Right. So let's go on. In those times, many shall arise against the king of the south. The lawless among you, your own people, shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, not even his picked troops, for there shall be no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall take the actions he pleases, and no one shall withstand him. He shall take a position in the beautiful land, and all of it shall be in his power. He shall set his mind to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of peace and perform them. So we are still essentially in the same conflict. And the aftermath is that the Ptolemies employ local forces which end up rioting, right? So the Ptolemies, who just lost the Syrian war, now have to deal with the rebellion of their own forces, which happened relatively frequently in antiquity. Again, in Crusader Kings, if you run out of cash, the Viking horde is actually going to attack you. That happens very often in the first couple of years, right? It's when you usually rage quit and you choose like a different petty king in Ireland. So Ptolemy IV, of course, had to suppress the rebellion. And in the 5th Syrian war, another one, Antiochus III defeats Ptolemy V, Epiphanes, and occupies Judea. So here the beautiful land is, of course, the land of Judea. So again, just amazing, completely mind-blowing, right? This is absolutely incomparable to, for example, all of the prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament, right? Like, think about it. Nativity, maybe him being born in Bethlehem comes close to it, but yeah, just give me a break. This is actually amazing. So let's keep going. So in order to destroy the kingdom, he shall give him a woman in marriage, but it shall not succeed or be to his advantage. Afterwards he shall turn to the coastlands and shall capture many. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn back towards the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So here we have the Romans being mentioned in the Bible. If you don't know about it, the Romans actually show up in the Bible, right? They are, of course, this is, of course, talking about a commander. So what happened is after the war, Ptolemy V marries Cleopatra Syra, who is a Seleucid empress. And Antiochus III, the Great, tries to conquer the Aegean, but he's pushed back by none other than Lucius Cornelius Scipio. And so, yeah, we have Scipio himself, right? The great general, actually mentioned in the Bible. Again, how many Christians know that the Bible, in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, actually is talking about the Romans already, right? Again, centuries before. Well, actually, that would be even centuries before the decades, I would say, before the foundation of the Roman Republic, right? Of course, when Daniel was sitting by the rivers of Babylon, um, Rome was just an insignificant kingdom, ruled by who would that be? Tarquinius Superbus? No, that would be Marcus Ancus in the beginning of the 6th century. But anyway, right? Like, again, it's completely mind blowing, right? Let's keep going. So let's keep lining this up, and let's really expose this for being the greatest, the best, the most detailed, the most accurate biblical prophecy in all of the Bible, both New and Old Testament. Then shall arise in his place one, who shall send an official for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, not through, though not in anger or in battle. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning, and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. By the way, have you guys noticed that I'm getting like a British accent? I think that this really uh, works for me, right? I should probably keep reading even more. Let's go through chapter 12 and chapter 13 and 14. It's not like I have better things to do, don't you know? So, how does this line to secular history? Does it line up with secular history? Of course, it does, because this is the Bible. This is the inspired word of God, right? So, of course, everything that it teaches and everything that it proclaims is without error. So, what happened was that Seleucus IV became king, and he sent a guy named Heliodorus to Jerusalem to collect money in order to pay the Romans, essentially pay pay off the defeat, the tribute that the Seleucids now have to pay the Romans because they were expelled from Greece and they had to give up a lot of land, especially in Asia Minor. So where do you get money in the Seleucid Empire? Well, there is this amazing temple in Jerusalem, right, which is just packed with golden stuff. So let's take it. So he sends this guy Heliodorus, and this is not what the book of Daniel says, but we have it in Second Maccabees. And by the way, see if this sounds familiar, right? So Heliodorus, when he's on his way to persecute the people of God, is actually receives a vision of a divine being. He's completely actually falls to the ground and he loses consciousness. He is taken care of by a pious person, by a believer. And when he recovers, he converts to the religion and starts proclaiming it. Sounds familiar? Kind of sounds like Paul, right? Not exactly. Paul doesn't go unconscious. He just is blinded temporarily, but otherwise it lines up pretty good, right? And of course, people pointed out that the Damascus Road experience in Acts, which is not actually narrated by Paul himself, it's not found in any of his letters, it's only found in the book of Acts, is actually a literary invention that is modeled after the conversion of Heliodorus in Second Maccabees. And again, if we were just normal historians and we didn't hold the Bible to a special higher standard, or I would say lower standard, and we would see these two stories about a divine revelation, about appearance of a divine being in any other ancient literature, in Roman literature, Greek literature, oh, well, we would, as good historians, just conclude, okay, either there is a genetic link, which means one of the authors used the other author as a literary blueprint, or this just draws from the same, cultural background, right? What we wouldn't conclude probably is that there really were two separate but very similar appearances of a divine being in history. Let's say Heracles or Zeus, right? But this is the Bible, so I mean, look at it. There are these amazing biblical prophecies that are like 100% accurate. So of course, this must be divinely inspired, right? Okay, yeah. So money is well, Seleucids try to collect money, but Heliodorus actually ends up assassinating Seleucus IV, right? And Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, becomes king thanks to intrigue. For example, he assassinates Heliodorus and his son, and son of Seleucus IV, who would be the next in line normally, right? So again, this is what Daniel is talking about exactly, right? He shall obtain the kingdom through intrigue, exactly what we see in secular sources. So let's go on. Armies shall be utterly swept away and broken before him, of the covenant as well. And after an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and become strong with a small party. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and do what none of his predecessors had ever done, lavishing plunder, spoil, and wealth on them. He shall devise plans against the strongholds, but only for time. So the Prince of the Covenant is obviously Onias the third, who is assassinated. He's murdered, I think, in 174, if I'm not mistaken, BCE, of course. Who is the Jerusalem high king, right? A Jerusalem high priest. So when Daniel elsewhere is talking about a Messiah shall be cut off and shall have nothing, this is the Messiah that he's talking about, right? It's Onias the third, who would be, of course, the Messiah, or I should say a Messiah, because he would be anointed by the holy oil. Of course, not only kings, but high priests were anointed by the holy oil in the Jerusalem temple, and that's made them Messiah, which means anointed, right? Christos in Greek. So he is killed. And Menelaus, not to be confused with Menelaus of the Troy fame, the Hellenizer, who is a member of what's called the Hellenistic Party, right? So now there is an internal split within the Jewish nation between Hellenized Jews who were okay with maybe adopting some of the Greek culture, maybe like running around naked in gymnasiums and like going to Greek theater and studying Greek philosophy, and Orthodox Jews who rejected that. And the Hellenized Jews, had the Hellenistic Party. And this guy Menelaus actually seized sacred vessels from the temple because he needed to pay bribes that got him the position of the high priest, instead of Onias III, right? So this is exactly what, again, the book of Daniel describes. So he lavishes plunder, spoil, and wealth. Which is something that none of his predecessors had ever done. Again, this is amazingly historically precise, right? So how do you feel about it now, right? I think we are like 2/3 of the way there. I wonder what Matt Dillahunty would say to this, right? He couldn't, of course, say what he normally says, right? Because this is just a completely different caliber. And again, like, how many of you knew that this is actually in the Bible? That if you ever find yourself studying for an exam from Hellenistic history, you can just crack open a chapter in the Bible, and it's a textbook essentially. The Bible is the textbook of international relations in Syro-Palestine between like the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century BCE. It's just amazing. Just like read right between the lines the names of the kings and their titles, and there you go. You don't have to change anything about it, right? Why read Polybius when you can just read this? It's much more concise, right? There are no boring speeches or anything like that. Descriptions of battles and how many horses died. This is just raw history. So here we go. Let's continue. He shall stir up his power. Let me try to do an American accent now. And determination against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall wage war with a much greater and stronger army. But he shall not succeed, for plots shall be devised against him by those who eat of the royal rations. They shall break him. This sounds more like the guy from Stronghold, right? Double rations, great. Okay. They shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall be slain. The two kings, their minds bent on evil, shall sit at one table and exchange lies. But it shall not succeed, for there remains an end at the time appointed. So this is why I love the Bible, right? The imagery, the word picture that it paints. Here we have two kings, their minds bent on evil. This is like what's the guy who wrote the Game of Thrones? George R. Martin. Yeah, this is like George R. I've never read it, but well, actually, I read the first episode, the first part, like years before it became popular, and I thought it's kind of meh. So I didn't read any of it. But yeah, like this is like George R. Martin, right? Two kings, their minds bent on evil. It's like a movie trailer, shall sit at one table and exchange lies. Better story than Twilight, you have to say, right? So what's actually happening here in history? Well, Antiochus IV invades Egypt in the Sixth Syrian War. So take shot against Ptolemy the Sixth, Philomenon. Ptolemy the Sixth has to deal with court officials who actually try to install his sister Cleopatra II on the throne, right? So where Daniel says, but he shall not succeed, for plots shall be devised against him by those who eat of the royal rations, double rations. Well, this is of course talking about the people centered around Cleopatra II, right? They are of course part of the court, so they eat at the same table as the king. After the war, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy IV sign a peace treaty, and these are the two kings who sit at the same table and exchange lies. Because of course there have been like 6 Syrian wars already, so it must have been super awkward to sign like peace treaties, right? Like it's obvious that you are going to violate the truth. Well, in some cases, almost immediately, like next year, right? So I guess that must have been really, really awkward and just formal. But who knows? Like maybe these guys actually thought about it as like a game, right? So of course, like thousands of people were killed in their armies, like regular foot soldiers, right? But maybe they were just chill about it. Maybe when they met, they were like, "Hey, long time no see. That was a great battle, right? Like, did you see how my left flank? I don't think this is the case, by the way, right? Because usually after these wars, I'm not sure if you noticed, but usually after the war, there is a new guy. Like the numeral goes up, and that's because like when you lose war, there's almost always trouble at home, and people will have you assassinated, or they will raise up against you because they will think that you're weak. So these wars were actually kind of a big deal, and there was a lot of stake even for these royal officials. And they still fought in the battles. They were not like sitting somewhere on a tent, just overseeing the battlefield, right? So they had their hands dirty, and a lot of these kings were actually killed in sieges, in battles, and stuff like that. So let's go on. We are almost there. He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. He shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. But this time it shall not be as it was before, for ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw. He shall be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. So here we have Romans again showing up in the Old Testament. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes spends winter of 169 in Jerusalem, right? So this is the reference to the Holy Covenant. He invades Egypt then again the next year and almost captures actually Alexandria. But by this point, at this point in time, the Ptolemies actually have like super good relations with Rome. The Ptolemaic Empire was actually the first of the Eastern, Hellenistic empires to make official diplomatic contact with the Romans after, I think, the first, I would say, Punic War. And traditionally during the Hellenistic period, the ally of the Roman Empire in Eastern Mediterranean were the Ptolemies. There were actually specific, like Ptolemaic kings who were installed, at least one, who were installed on the Egyptian throne, specifically through the assistants of Rome, and like pretenders to the Ptolemaic throne were actually like physically present in Greece, in Rome, in the city, just like borrowing money so they can bribe Roman senators to vote for military campaigns that would install them to the throne, right? True story. But here, what happened is that Alexandria was almost conquered, but there was a Roman embassy sent there, and they basically just told Antiochus IV to back off. And he did. He actually abandoned the siege and withdrew. So here we already have Rome, who at this point was, well, basically a hegemon in the Mediterranean Empire, right? Like these Hellenistic empires were declining really rapidly. And now the Romans didn't even have to send legions. They didn't have to send, the army. They could just send an embassy, and they would tell a king of an empire, a follower, a successor of Alexander himself, to just leave Egypt alone and go home. And he did. So yeah, this is very telling. Again, we have this in the Bible, guys. That's amazing. And let's flow through this. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up an abomination that makes desolate. And if you're familiar with Book of Daniel, this of course rings a bell, right? The abomination that desolates shows up elsewhere in the Book of Daniel, and it shows up in the New Testament as well. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. The wise amongst the people shall give up understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by the sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. When they fall victim, they shall receive little help, and many shall join them insincerely. Some of the wise shall fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end, for there is still an interval until the time appointed. So what happens, of course, and this is the famous history, like if you've ever watched a video about the Book of Daniel, you probably know about it. So Antiochus IV actually tries to essentially unify this empire by doing what we would today call a religious reform. So specifically, well, it was a practice really for these Eastern rulers for centuries to essentially let their subjects worship the gods that they want. They didn't really disrupt traditional temples, traditional cults. They didn't abolish rituals. They didn't really care what people, how people were worshiping. Oracles were, of course, just business as usual, right? But Antiochus IV has this idea that actually, really, if I want to have a powerful centralized empire, and if I want to kind of work against the tendencies that are, if I want to reverse the decline of the empire, I need to make sure that everyone inside the empire is on the same page, let's say ideologically or culturally, right? So actually, it seems he started implementing what we would today call a religious reform, and specifically he tried to get all the people in his empire, because of course this Eastern empire is still relatively large, even diminished. All kinds of different ethnicities, different languages, different culture, different heritages, right? They were all polytheists except for the Jews, of course, and maybe the Zoroastrians, but there was, of course, syncretism going on, right? So you really wouldn't think that your next door neighbor is worshiping a different god. You would just think it's the same god with a different name, maybe, or a local deity, right? But Antiochus actually tried to harmonize culture, let's say, make sure that everyone accepts specifically Greek culture. So he was really pushing things like Greek dress code. He was pushing worship of Greek gods. But this actually, and by the way, this is what the Romans tried to do at the end of the empire, right? Like Romans were actually amazingly tolerant when it comes to people practicing their religion. For example, atheism and even offending the gods was never a criminal charge. It was never a crime in Rome, right? This is completely mind-blowing. Like in Athens, we have actually several people who were almost executed and who had to flee to exile because they committed, they offended the gods, right? There was a specific charge. Socrates is obviously one of the most famous examples, or the most famous example. But there were many others, but described it didn't exist in Rome. And there was a maxim of the Roman law, which essentially said an offense to the god, an offense to the gods is a case for the gods, which means, okay, if you offend the gods, the gods will actually deal with you themselves, right? They don't need the state to fight for them, right? They don't need the state to enforce any kinds of laws against impious behavior. They will just strike you down. They will execute revenge on you personally themselves, right? So they don't need lawyers. And this of course caused the Romans to be amazingly tolerant when it comes to religions. But that changed in the late antiquity when the Roman Empire was in trouble, and they actually start building a centralized cult that everyone could get behind, right? It started with the worship of the sun, which was existing cult that was brought from the east. We all know Sol Invictus, and it fused with the cult of Mithra, who, as we all know, celebrated on the 25th of December. Just triggering some apologies there. But yeah, Antioch was essentially the same story, right? Empire in decline. Makes sense to get everyone on board, line up ideologically. It's backfired spectacularly because what he did was that he dedicated the temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, to Zeus Olympius, and he erected a statue of Zeus there. There isn't anything worse that you could do to an ancient Jew than erect a statue, an idol, right, in the temple. So, of course, the Maccabean revolt breaks out, and the rest of this passage is essentially the Judean People's Front fighting the Union of the Judean People, or whatever, right? So it essentially describes like the partisanship and the different developments during the Maccabean revolt. Like, again, I would just refer you to First and Second Maccabees. First Maccabees, much more historically reliable, I would say. And yeah, you will see that it's not as simple as just like people lining up, all the Jews lining up, under the banner of the Maccabean brothers. It was actually a very complicated situation. So yeah, here we don't really have prophecy per se. We just have Daniel essentially talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and just like how evil he is, right? So the king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god. He shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the period of wrath is completed. For what is determined shall be done. He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors, or to the one beloved by women. He shall pay no respect to any other god, for he shall consider himself greater than all. He shall honor the gods of fortresses instead of these. A god whom his ancestors did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall make more wealthy, and shall appoint them as rulers over many, and shall distribute the land for a price. So this is essentially like describing, of course, with an ideological bias, right? Like with an ideological bent, the religious reform of Antiochus and the different deities that were involved. Not really describing events per se, battles, marriages, intrigues, assassinations, stuff like that. So we can move on. And this is actually the last, I think, section. But here, guys, something amazing happens. So we've been going for like how many? 39 verses in chapter 11, and it was completely amazing. It was completely mind blowing. Like I'm almost a Christian right now. Like I'm just completely taken away, and I don't know what to say. Right? Like I really have to suppress the knowledge of God that I of course have in my own righteousness, like really hard, and I really have to like put an extra layer of scales over my eyes, right? It's like when scales don't make it for me anymore. Just being confronted with this amazing prophecy, right? So, but now there's a problem, and everything suddenly crumbles because it no longer lines up. Suddenly there's a break, and the rest of the prophecy is just completely tits up, right? It's like if we take any account, and we have multiple accounts from the ancient world of what happened next, well, it's just completely, the historical accuracy is just out the window. Let's take a look at it, and let's really brace ourselves for the shock, right? How this could be after 39 verses of just like hitting every single event, every single person, specific battles, specific wars, specific marriages, alliances, peace treaties. What's going on? Let's go on. Let's read it. At the time and the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. He shall advance against countries and pass through like a flood. He shall come into the beautiful land, and tens of thousands shall fall victim. But Edom and Moab and the main power of the Ammonites shall escape from his power. He shall stretch out his hands against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler over treasures of gold and of silver and all the riches of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians, okay, wow, shall follow in his train. But reports from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to burn ruin and complete destruction to many. He shall pitch his palatal tent between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, with no one to help him. So, what's going to happen to Antiochus the fourth? Well, of course, he's going to conquer Egypt, right? The land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler over all the riches of Egypt, and he will even conquer Libya, which, by the way, in the ancient world was the term for Africa, right? So Libya equals Africa. Egypt usually wasn't located in Libya. It was either located in Asia, according to this ancient geography, or actually the Nile River was the border between Asia and Libya. So 3 continents: Europe, Asia, Libya. So he'll conquer all of Africa, right? Not just where Libya is today. Yeah. The Ethiopians, right? So not just Egypt, but Ethiopians. And by the way, Ethiopians in the ancient world just was like a more general expression for just people who live in very far exotic lands in the south. So it was kind of like wasn't really a well-defined specific nation. It's just if you wanted to, like an author, point to a nation which lives like super far away and is like weird and exotic, you would go either for Scythians if you wanted to go north, for Indians if you wanted to go east, and Ethiopians if you wanted to talk about people living in the south. Like already in Homer, for example, it says that Zeus was absent at the siege of Troy, and that allowed the other gods to get away with stuff that they wouldn't be able to get away with if Zeus was there. And he was away attending a feast in his honor in Ethiopia. And the reason why Homer says Ethiopia is because that's for him like the other side of the world, right? Well, actually, he thought that the world is flat, so it wouldn't be the other side of the world. It would be just as far away as possible, right? That's just a stand-in, a placeholder for like a really, really far away nation, essentially. So again, here, Antiochus III, surely it's not going to conquer only Egypt, but he will even conquer the land south of Egypt. So it seems he will essentially take over the whole world, right? But then he will actually have to withdraw his armies and himself from Egypt, and he's going to die before in the land in between the sea and the holy mountain, in the beautiful land, which is of course Judea, right? Well, what happened in history? Is this what history records? Like if we crack open Polybius, do we find this? Well, no. And that's kind of fucked up. So Ptolemy the fourth actually never attacks Antiochus Ptolemy VI, sorry, actually never attacks Antiochus IV. So when it says the king of the south shall attack him, that never takes place. That never takes place. Actually, Ptolemies are just completely busy with internal infighting and struggles and like revolts because they just completely failed in the Sixth Syrian War. Right at this point, Egypt was like a failed state. Right, nothing worked. Right, but Antiochus IV actually never conquers Egypt because you have to remember that he was in the middle of a failing religious reform, which just completely like shattered his realm even further. And for example, there was this massive revolt in Palestine, the Maccabean revolt, right, which went surprisingly well. And Maccabeans were actually supported, at least diplomatically, by the Romans, which complicated the situation even more, right? Because Romans were allies with the Ptolemies. Ptolemies were enemies of the Seleucids. Romans fought the Seleucids before. Antiochus III the Great was repelled by, Cornelius Scipio. So, of course, the Romans would just lend aid to the Maccabean revolt, right? Because enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they actually, after the Maccabean revolt succeeded and an independent Hasmonean kingdom in Palestine was set up, they had pretty okay relations with Rome. And it's not a coincidence that like the Herods would be allied to Rome as well. This is just a continuation of the policy. But the point is that Egypt, not great. Antiochus IV, not great. And actually, a different ruler of a different part of the world, Mithridates I of Parthia, takes advantage of the situation and attacks from the east. So not from the north, but from the east. And Antiochus IV, actually, and this is very important, doesn't personally wage war in Judea, but instead he appoints a commander named Lysias, a relatively minor character, obscure character in history, to wage war in Judea, right? So he isn't there. He just nathos to the far east to fight in Parthia, Parthians, right? Parthians. These are the purple pajama guys, right? In Rome Total War. So I'm sure everyone is. They have trash infantry, but if you just spam stacks of horse archers with like several upgrades, you'll just completely like mow through. You will win battles like 3-1 outnumbered without losing a single horse, right? Maybe there will be like one horse who will get glitched on like war walls or something like that. But yeah, otherwise you will just completely machine gun your way through the map and just paint it pink, right? And you will just have your pajama men as garrison, cheap garrison, right? So these guys essentially they took the opportunity, they smelled prey, and they raced against Antiochus IV. So he personally, because this was a much bigger threat to be honest, than the Maccabean revolt even, just decided to go there personally, and he died in Far East. So again, he didn't die in Judea. And that's it, right? So what explains this? How is it the case that we have this amazing, detailed prophecy in the Bible? Almost 40 verses. No competition the best prophecy in the Bible, right? It mentions, I would say, dozens, well, certainly over a dozen different people, mentions specific places, specific battles, specific marriages, specific alliances, specific intrigues, and then somehow immediately it breaks, right? Just somehow maybe Daniel was like knocked in the head, or he got distracted and like didn't hear the vision correctly. Like, what's the explanation, right? And here you have to ask yourself the $1 million question, right? Like, what's more likely? When we see this amazing prophecy hitting every single nail, right, every single point, but just suddenly flying off the wall, you have to ask yourself, what's more likely? That this is really informed by God, right? This is really divinely inspired. But somehow it fails. Or that the author of the book, this wasn't actually Daniel who wrote in like the 6th century, right? But it was actually a guy, probably, writing in the middle of the events that he's describing. So he's not actually describing what's going to happen in the future. He's just describing what happened like relatively recently, decades, ago, probably using some historical source that he has available, and just like placing it on the lips of this Daniel guy who maybe never even existed. I would say probably never even existed. Um, and the reason why the prophecy suddenly breaks and is no longer following what we know happened is because at one point he flipped from describing the past being the future. And of course, you don't see it in the prophecy. There's nothing that indicates it if you don't know what actually happened in the past, right? What happened in history. But if you actually line it up, you'll see that, yeah, the reason why it flies off the wall is because at some point, this guy didn't know what's going to happen, right? He didn't know that Antiochus IV is not going to invade Egypt. So he took some chances, he put it into the book, and that stopped lining up, right? Because if you don't actually know the future, this is what will happen eventually, right? So what's more likely? And I think the second answer is much more likely, right? So yeah, and of course, what's even more spicy is that this is not the end of the chapter. I should say this is the end of the chapter, but then the vision actually goes on, right? And I suspect that the reason why in the Middle Ages the break between chapters was placed here is for reasons that will become obvious shortly, right? So we are in the chapter 12, first 4 verses. At that time, so remember, we are talking about the time following the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which happened in 60s of the 2nd century BCE, right? So at the time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. This is, of course, talking about the archangel Michael. There shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. So, do you guys know of the great genetic bottleneck that we actually know of in ancient, like in the genetic record, right? Like Christian evolutionists at Biologos would tell you that, yeah, if we look at our common genetic heritage, we will find out that at some point, a couple, I think, 1,000 years ago, something happened and it has been tied. This is like just a hypothesis, right? But it has been tied to even a specific eruption of a volcano, which changed climate and it caused mass extinction. And it almost caused extinction of people, right? Because the human population actually shrink to I think they say about 1,000 people, less than 1,000, something like that, right? So all of the people today, this is as close as you will ever get, by the way, to Adam and Eve, right? 1,000 people. So everyone alive today, like you, me, a guy on the other side of the planet, like James Fodor, or I should say, like a native Australian. We are all descended from the same group of about 1,000 people because everyone else died, right? But here, in the middle of the 2nd century, at the time of the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, there should be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. So forget that bottleneck. Something even worse happened in the middle of the 2nd century. But at that time, your people shall be delivered. They shall be saved, you could say. Everyone who is written in the book, and this is, of course, the great, ledger in heaven where all the sins of all the people are being kept, right? Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt, right? So now there is absolutely no question what this is describing. This is describing parousia. This is describing the general resurrection of the dead from the dead in the middle of the 2nd century, right? The end of the age, the coming of the kingdom of the God, right? The wheel of the universe has turned. And yeah, people are just raised. This is what the Jews were expecting the whole time. Everyone is raised, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting shame and contempt. which either means forever or for a really long time, because ancient languages were not that precise. But anyway, those who are wise shall shine, right, the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the like the stars forever and ever. So, do you guys remember that 3-hour stream that Cameron Battusi did with those two guys, two scholars, neither of which were actually historians or New Testament scholars, and which we reviewed on Nathan's channel with James Fodor for like 6 hours, right? So one of the things that these guys actually said is that, look, if the appearances narratives in the Gospels of like the resurrected Jesus, how he looked like, what he did, were fictitious, the Gospel authors would never depict Jesus looking like this, because this is not how the Jews in the Second Temple period imagine people raised from the dead, right? They imagine them shining like the stars, like a sci-fi movie. And where do we get that from? We get it from here, actually, from this passage, right? And this is describing people being raised from the dead and shining like the stars in the middle of the 2nd century. So really, if you think that the saints being raised in Jerusalem when Jesus is crucified, the famous resurrected saints in the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, if you think that's far-fetched, right? If you think there is no way, there would be no like records anywhere in history that we can find. Just random people like sending letters, and Greek and Roman historians writing down, Josephus maybe writing down. Oh, by the way, like this one afternoon or morning in the 30s, suddenly like a group of people were raised from the dead, and they were walking through the streets of Jerusalem and appeared to many. Well, if you find it far-fetched, this must completely blow your mind, right? Here we actually have not just some saints somewhere in Jerusalem. We actually have the general resurrection. Everyone who is written in the book, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. And they are actually shining like the stars, right? Where is this in Polybius? Where is this in Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Diodorus of Sicily? Where is this in Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews? And we are going to get to Josephus, by the way, right? So yeah, but you, Daniel, keep the word secret and the book sealed until the day of the end. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. So here we can see that the book of Daniel, the prophecy breaks. It diverges from history pretty significantly, because I don't know if they taught you this in like elementary school, but yeah, there wasn't a second coming in the middle of the 2nd century after Antiochus IV Epiphanes died, right? And by the way, I don't have it here, but I have a Czech study Bible which has commentary, and they say that, like, I just completely love, by the way, the resources, because this is a study Bible. It was translated by theologians, of course, by Christians, and the commentary is very pro-Christian, so they will jump on every opportunity to emphasize, like, okay, this is Jesus being foreshadowed in the Old Testament, right? But actually, when you look at the commentary to chapter 11, it just goes through the same stuff that I gave you, right? It mentions all of these names of these kings and these battles, right? What do they do with chapter 11? Well, they just say, apparently, Daniel has now skipped to a distant past. Because what else can you say about it, right? Like, there wasn't a general resurrection in the 2nd century, right? But, at the time, your people, and I don't speak Hebrew, so I can't check the exact phraseology, but I did check Septuagint, the Greek translation, right? And yeah, it's from grammar, it's pretty clear that there isn't this massive jump in time. It's a continuous flow, it's continuous narration, and it uses vocabulary that signifies like contemporaneous events, right? So, yeah. So again, what's more likely, that this is actually divinely inspired, or that it was actually written by an author who lived in the middle of the 2nd century and who just narrated events going all the way to the 2nd century, but then he started narrating the future, which of course culminated with Parousia in his own time, like years from when he lived at most, right? Just waiting. Like, imagine yourself being in the situation. You just started a massive revolt. You need pious Jews to back you up. So what do? You write a prophecy. You put it on the lips of a figure from a distant past, a prophet. And this is, by the way, completely normal. This is nothing extraordinary. We have many, many examples of writings like these in the Second Temple period. We have testaments of Abraham and apocalypses of Abraham, and basically every figure from the Old Testament has a testament, an apocalypse, and at least one other book which is forged in their name, right? We have the apocalypse of Adam even, and stuff like that. And yeah, it's just people writing in the middle of the Second Temple period who invented a story, placed it on the lips of a great figure from the very distant past, and it very often contains this narration of historical events cast as a prophecy, as talking about the future, while in fact the real author is talking about the past, right? So yeah, I think this is what's going on. This is much more probable, and it's of course not the only piece of evidence that the Book of Daniel was actually written in the middle of the 2nd century, when these events were transpiring, right? When Antiochus IV Epiphanes was actually still alive and kicking, and people couldn't wait for him to kick the bucket. And there is an amazing, of course, series that I think a lot of you know about. I included a link to the first part of the series in the description of this video, made by none other than Dr. Josh and company over at the Digital Hammurabi channel, who they go over all of the different lines of evidence for thinking that the Book of Daniel was actually written in the middle of the 2nd century, because it's a cumulative case, right? It's not there are no silver bullets in history, right? History deals with probabilities, so you never prove a hypothesis with Cartesian certainty. But in this case, there is just a cumulative case, and the evidence keeps stacking and stacking, and eventually it's overwhelming, right? So we have Aramaic vocabulary and grammar, which is typical of 2nd century, right? Corresponds to the time period, but doesn't actually correspond to when the book supposedly was written. The Hebrew vocabulary and grammar, the same thing. And then there are, of course, additional historical problems, right? Darius the Mede. Christians wrote a lot of pages essentially trying to make Darius the Mede anyone else other than Darius the Mede. They're just going through like different historical characters that we have attested and just writing theses about how that guy is actually Darius the Mede, right? Because of course, like Daniel, who's supposed to be there in the 6th century, right, at the court, just describes people and events that we know from every other source didn't actually happen, and those people didn't exist. Like, we know who the king was at the time when Darius the Mede was supposed to be the king. It's not Darius the Mede, right? And he doesn't actually show up in other source. So again, what's more likely? That the author of the Book of Daniel was actually kind of hazy on very distant past, but he could get a more recent past better, or that this is somehow reconcilable and it's still divinely inspired and inerrant, right? And by the way, this is not a new thesis. People already know about it. Like, people already knew that this is the case in the ancient world, right? So, for example, Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, talks about the Book of Daniel. He talks about this prophecy, and he's of course smart, so he realizes that obviously the Book of Daniel is not talking about some distant future. It's talking about the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Right? Here is the quote, one of the quotes. He even specifically dates it. He counts from the time when Daniel supposedly lived, right? And he gives the time frame as 153rd Olympiad. So Olympiad was a unit of time. It was 4 years, because every 4 years in Olympia, in Elida, in Peloponnesos, there were, of course, the Olympic Games, right? And Greeks used that event for dating, apart from other things. And the first Olympiad, traditionally, even though this is fictional, was dated to 776 BCE. So 153rd Olympiad covers years 168 to 65, which of course completely lines up, right? So yeah. And by the way, if you know, maybe if you are a Christian apologist and you really know your stuff around the Old Testament, you might now say, this was a little bit of anticipation. So if you know your stuff around the Old Testament, you will say, well, hold on a minute. Josephus actually thinks that the Bible was written in by Daniel, right? Like he, of course, thought that it's talking about the reign of Antiochus IV. That's not controversial, but he actually still thought it was written by Daniel, right? And actually, he gives even historical evidence that the book could not have been written in the middle of the 2nd century because he narrates a story in which the book of Daniel was showed to Alexander the Great. And you would be correct. So there is, of course, this passage, again in Antiquities, where Josephus narrates the conquest of Alexander the Great and how it impacted Jewish history. And he has this amazing episode in which, Alexander, of course, goes through Palestine, and he's in Jerusalem. He's shown the Book of Daniel. So when the Book of Daniel was shown to him, in which he had declared that one of the Greeks would destroy the empire of the Persians, he believed himself to be the one indicated. So this would take place in the 4th century, of course. So the Book of Daniel could not have been written in the middle of the 2nd century, right? Well, actually, historians, of course, think this is false, right? This is just made up either by Josephus or by someone else. It's too good to be true. And it's probably, of course, it goes against all of the other pieces of evidence, right? So, on the whole, it makes it more probable that this story is false and the book was written in the middle of the 2nd century than that this story is false and it was actually written by, by someone earlier than Alexander, at least. But yeah, I mean, this story might even fit into how the Book of Daniel was problematic because there are some suggestions, some like indirect indications that actually the Book of Daniel didn't make it into the canon, almost. It barely did. Like these, by the way, evidences are not like super strong. For example, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, it's one of the last books of the Bible, if I'm not mistaken. So even this, like where it's exactly set in the corpus, because of course in Tanakh, much more than in the Christian Bible, the order in which the books are placed is meant to signify their importance and how much like emphasis is placed on them, right? And of course, the books towards the end of the Bible are, for example, never read from today in rabbinic Judaism, or very rarely, And really, if you are a rabbi, you're not probably going to break a lot of sweat about the book of Ecclesiastes. You will probably place much more emphasis on the Torah, of course, right? But the book of Daniel was kind of maybe included late. Maybe this story was invented to help legitimize it. And for example, of course, one of the most influential factions, one of the three major sections of Second Temple Judaism were the Sadducees, who denied the resurrection. And if you think about it, how could have they denied the resurrection if the book of Daniel very clearly talks about the general resurrection? Many will be raised, some to salvation and some to eternal destruction. Well, could it be the case that actually Sadducees, among other people, didn't think that Daniel is scripture? That's a really good explanation why they didn't think there are resurrections, right? That there won't be resurrections. And I think you can find some indications here. For example, this is extremely telling, by the way. Like if you find this kind of phraseology, this kind of language in ancient sources, there's something up, right? It says, "But you, Daniel, keep the word secret and the book sealed until the time of the end." When is the time of the end? Well, it's in the middle of the 2nd century, right? As soon as as Antiochus IV dies, well, the parousia starts, right? The general resurrection starts. So yeah, here essentially the book explains why is it the case that it was written in the 6th century, like it actually comes from Daniel, but nobody's ever heard about it until the middle of the 2nd century, when of course it was actually written, right? So here the book actually gives you an explanation that's meant to cover up the fact that it's a new creation. So nobody knows about it, like nobody knew about it in the past, right? This is super telling. This is all over ancient sources. You will very frequently find this feature of the narrative where it actually describes why is it the case that nobody knew about the story in the past, but it's actually the forger trying to essentially cover for himself and like provide a narrative inside the narrative for why is it the case that it's something new, right? Even though it was supposedly written centuries ago. Well, it's not new because I just made it up. I just forged it, right? Actually, the reason why this is news is because Daniel was instructed to keep the book secret until when? Well, until just now. That's the explanation, right? And I think if you find this line of reasoning, this like argumentation, this point made by an ancient source, it's actually a massive red flag that there is something going on with the dating, right? That it's actually being post-dated. It's actually ex eventu. So yeah. So that would be Josephus. And now I mentioned that there are examples of prophecies like this in ancient sources, like in non-Jewish and non-Christian sources. And I'll just show you 2 examples. And I want to highlight how normal historians, not Christian apologists, right? Like just normal historians who like wake up Monday morning and go to work, like probably read through thick German books from 19th century, just like doing normal research and don't think about Jesus, don't think about the Bible. They focus on like completely different topics in history. Don't really have like their theological beliefs and their theological biases don't really have any effect on their work. How they think about similar situations outside the Bible, because like I'm not a historian, right? Studying history, so the way how I think about these things is I always try to look at how historians who are not working with the Bible are dealing with similar issues. How they are dealing with similar issues, for example, in Greek and Roman sources. Because there it's like an example, like a blueprint for how to do it well and without theological bias, because there is no theological bias there, right? Nobody's worshiping Zeus. Nobody has any interest in defending the Greek gods, right? So free from bias, this is how it's done. So let's just apply the same standard towards the Bible. Let's not keep the Bible at like a different level, right? Let's actually look at some of these prophecies and how ancient historians, like contemporary historians of antiquity, look at them. So this is something that I had, I think, a stream ago. This is, of course, amazing prophecy in the book of Iliad, in the Iliad of Homer, of course. It's talking about Aeneas, one of the heroes at Troy, who is being saved last moment before Achilles kills him. And I think Poseidon, if I'm not mistaken, prophesies it is fated, moreover, that he should escape, and that the race of Dardanos, whom Zeus loved above all the sons born to him of mortal women. So this is the people who, Aeneas is leader of. Well, at this point, still Anchises, his father, but yeah, shall not perish utterly without seed or sign. For now, indeed, has Zeus hated the blood of Priam, while Aeneas shall reign over the Trojans, he and his children's children that shall be born hereafter. So this is actually prophecy, right? This is a god, a deity in the story of the Iliad, prophesying that Aeneas is going to survive the Trojan War, which he did, and he is going to found a great nation. Now, of course, later this tradition was adopted by the Romans and other people. Romans, by the way, are not the only people who claim they are descendants from like survivors of Troy, the siege of Troy. That was actually very popular. For example, a lot of the barbarian nations, especially in late antiquity, had their like national myth building, especially uh, based on this idea that they also are like descendants from Troy, right? Uh, that was probably mostly done under Roman influence, so they were like imitating existing Roman myths, but that's a different story, right? But yeah, the Romans did that, but actually, contemporary historians of antiquity think that this is actually a prophecy talking about someone else, right? So I just pull out a random article on this, and it's actually starts. Throughout the history of modern scholarship on Homer, it has been widely believed that the 20th book of the Iliad, which is the passage that I've just read, and the hymn to Aphrodite, which contains a similar prophecy, I would say the same prophecy, were composed for a court of barbarian princes in the Troad, who believed themselves descended from Aeneas. The belief that the poet of the hymn wished to honor such patrons is meant to account for the hymn's telling of the story of Aphrodite's encounter with Anchises, that's Aeneas' father, and especially for her prediction that Anchises' son will rule among the Trojans and will give birth to a continuing family. So again, historians who don't care about the Bible, don't work on the Bible, when they see this prophecy, the first thing that they think is, okay, this is ex eventu. A much later author, an author writing centuries after the events supposedly took place, just wrote the prophecy in because it reflects something about his own time, right? In this case, he essentially wanted to suck up to a court of royals reigning over the territory where Troy used to be, and who believed themselves to be descended from one of the soldiers, one of the heroes fighting at Troy, right? So he just penned down this prophecy, and they were happy because they could point to it and say, look, our dynasty, our rule, our claim over this land and this dominion was actually prophesied in the past by, none other than Poseidon, right? So that's really great to have in your bloodline, right? So yeah, that's the rationale behind it. So again, I think if the Bible was kept at the consistent standard, if we applied the same standard towards the Book of Daniel specifically, and we didn't treat the Bible differently, we didn't give it special attention, then that's what we would conclude as well. Doesn't it sound reasonable? Isn't it more probable, in this case, that this is an excellent prophecy than that Poseidon actually did prophesy it and did come to pass? Isn't it more probable that Book of Daniel was actually written in the middle of the 2nd century, rather than that this is actually a prophecy delivered to Daniel that then somehow, for some reason, just completely breaks away from what we know happened in the past? But we can actually do even better. So I'll give you a second example, and I think this is fully comparable to what we've just witnessed in the Book of Daniel. So this is Virgil's Aeneid. Specifically, it's a part of the narrative where where Aeneas descends to the underworld, and he meets all kinds of people in the underworld. Right, he sees a lot of interesting things. It's really like probably the best part of the Aeneid, and that's not just my opinion. That's like fairly common, right? Like people who've read Aeneid usually like book 6 the most because it's like the craziest. It's really a fantasy at that point because they are, it's like a guided tour of the underworld. And Aeneas, among other things, receives a prophecy how he will found a great nation who will go on to do great things and essentially conquer the world, right? And the prophecy is amazingly detailed. It mentions all kinds of specific people who, in the framing of the story, would be born centuries later, right? So, for example, Deci, Drusi, Camillus, the famous general who salvaged the defeat of the Romans by the Gauls and sacking of Rome, right, in the 4th century BCE. It mentions Julius Caesar by name, right? If you think about it, like in the story, Aeneas, who lives in like 12th century, 12th or 13th century, right, like 1,200 years before Julius Caesar, is being given a prophecy in the underworld about Julius Caesar being a dictator in Rome, right? And actually, one of the things that Aeneas sees in the underworld are souls, essentially, of people who are yet to be born. So he actually sees, for example, right, he meets Romulus, who has not been born yet. He's just waiting for his time to show up on the world stage. Pompey is mentioned as well. Aemilius Paulus, who was very important during the Roman conquest of Greece. We have Cato, of course. We have the Gracchi brothers, the great social reformers. Scipios, two of them here. So Book of Daniel has only one Scipio. This prophecy has two of them, right? So Fabius Maximus the Delayer. Amazing stuff, right? It completely blows your mind away. There is no way how this prophecy could be fulfilled, right? Like it's not a coincidence that this prophecy is narrated, and then a guy who is actually named Julius Caesar becomes ruler in Rome, right? But of course, everyone realizes, and like not even historians, but like everyone, of course, realizes that this was just written by Virgil, who was actually living during the reign of Augustus Caesar. So, in some cases, centuries after these people died. And he's just writing a prophecy, but he's actually narrating Roman history because he wants to underline how great the Romans have been and how they will continue to be great under the leadership of Caesar Augustus. And this is really a very close parallel to the book of Daniel, not only because it has this amazing level of detail, and not only because to normal people, it's immediately obvious that the author is just narrating history and casting it as prophecy, but it's also similar to the book of Daniel because just like the book of Daniel, Virgil at some point gets the prophecy wrong because he starts narrating events that have not happened yet from his point of view, and they don't line up with what ended up happening, right? And it's this part. So he's talking about again here Caesar, and then he goes on to talk about Caesar Augustus, son of the deified, meaning Julius Caesar, who will make a golden age again in the fields where Saturn once reigned, and extend the empire beyond the Libyans. So again, he will conquer Africa, like all of it, and the Indians. So Augustus Caesar will extend the Roman Empire beyond India to a land that lies outside the zodiac's belt, beyond the sun's ecliptic, and the years where sky-carrying Atlas turns the sphere, inset with gleaming stars on his shoulders. So here, Virgil kind of makes a bet because, like, if you were living in Virgil's time, particularly before the defeat of in the Teutoburg forest, you would just think that you are living in you're just a contemporary of the next Alexander the Great, right? Like the people at the time probably thought because like Octavius, Caesar Augustus was the last man standing in this like several massive civil wars where most of the Roman aristocracy at the time just slaughtered each other mostly through proscriptions and in battles. And he was just the guy who won. Amazing military genius, right? Especially given that he started pretty much as a nobody. Yeah, he was adopted by Caesar, but Caesar was assassinated, and people thought he was kind of a tyrant, right? That he probably would try to set up himself a king. He would do a coup, maybe, and steer the Roman Empire towards fascism, but luckily he was assassinated. Um, but yeah, like Caesar Augustus actually won. He was the king of the hill. So people at the time just naturally expected that he will just go on conquering, right? And he won't stop. He will, of course, go on to conquer all the territories that Alexander the Great conquered, all the way to the Indus River, right? Because who really was Alexander the Great? The Macedonians were nobodies. They were the village bumpkins. They were the rednecks of the Greek-speaking world, right? Macedonia wasn't really taken that seriously in the classical period. And if you told Pericles that actually it's going to be Macedonia who will be the great power in the Aegean, he would just laugh at you because they were just goat herders. They were barely civilized, you know. They claimed to be Greek. They kind of spoke Greek. They claimed to be descendants of Heracles, of course, just like everyone else. But they were kind of like Scots, something like that, you know. Or in my case, the Slovaks. But then suddenly, this guy from this like backwater nation just went on to conquer the half of the known world, right? So it would just make sense. It would be plausible for someone who be a victor in this massively bloody civil war, who is a Roman from the best nation, the most pious nation, the nation that the gods themselves favor and destined for glory and world domination. It was just obvious that he will go on and conquer not just what Alexander the Great conquered, but he will go even further, right? He will go beyond India, beyond Ethiopia. And I think you can plausibly read this as him suggesting that he will even conquer outer space. He will go on to conquer the lands that lie outside the zodiac's belt, right? Beyond the sun's ecliptic. Because in the ancient thought, there was obviously life on other planets. There were like nations, civilizations on other planets. There are sci-fi novels, at least one, that describes like wars between Mars and Moon over the colonization of Venus, for example. Some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, I think it was Anaxagoras, described how there are like rivers and houses on the moon. The Nemean lion, for example, in some versions of the myth, is a creature that fell from the moon. So it wasn't implausible that, Virgil just saw that Romans are so great they will conquer space, you know. And if you've played Stellaris, you probably made that happen. But in actual history, not so much, right? So again, a normal historian who isn't a Christian apologist, or in this case, like a pagan apologist, Roman apologist, would just look at it and he would immediately obviously conclude that, okay, this was written, even if he didn't know who wrote it, by the way, if he didn't know that Aeneid was actually written by Virgil, I think it's almost certain as something can be in ancient history, that, historians today would take a look at it and they would conclude that, okay, this was obviously written when Augustus Caesar was emperor, because it describes Roman history leading up to his own reign. It casts it as a prophecy. But then it just goes to the top and it starts talking about conquering space, which we know didn't happen, right? And the Romans didn't conquer the Middle East all the way up to the Indians. Actually, Caesar Augustus was, with the exception of like Dacia and Britain and Mesopotamia for a while, he actually was it was the point in time when the Roman Empire stopped growing for a really long time, all the way up until the late antiquity, right? It started to collapse. So yeah, he kind of didn't get that right. But yeah, that's the point. This is what I wanted to show you. What I wanted to show you was, hands down, the best prophecy in the Bible. Absolutely amazing. I'm sure it would completely blow Mendelhanty away, right? He would have nothing to say. But again, what's more likely? That this is a guy writing what he knows already happened, as if it was a prophecy about the future, or that it actually is a prophecy about the future, right? Especially given that if historians who don't care about the Bible, don't care about Jesus, especially not in their professional work, see, I would say, pretty comparable things in Greek and Roman sources, they immediately conclude, okay, this is what's going on, right? Like, you don't have to be a skeptic. You don't have to have an anti-supernatural bias. you don't have to be hell-bent on destroying Christianity and like being under the power of Satan. It's just like common sense, right? So yeah, this is what I wanted to say. Questions. Let's wait for the chat to catch up. And if you have any questions or comments, we can talk about it. How about dropping a stream about Richard Carrier's approach to Jesus mythicism? Yeah, this is not going to be a channel about Jesus mythicism or Jesus' historicity for two reasons. First, I would probably alienate some of my audience, and I don't want to do that. And second, I actually repeatedly asked people who, for some reason, like to listen to what I have to say. I don't know why. What should I invest my time in? Debunking Jesus mythicism or just going after Christian apologists? And every single time, 100% of the time, they told me, do counter apologetics, right? So here I go. And actually, like, I could read up on, I would have to reread on the historicity of Jesus, and I would have to read up on his sources and like what the responses have been. And I'm like 100% convinced that I would completely crush Richard Carrier in a debate. You have no idea. That would be legendary. It would be one of the best debates ever. He has no idea what's coming. And especially like all of the responses to his book have been pretty bad with very few exceptions. Because people who respond to him, first of all, probably never even read it, and because they don't really know how, like, what to do with it, how to deal with it. Right? They're not Bayesians. They don't understand like what he's talking about, right? So they just keep bringing up all the brother of the Lord and Jesus being made out of the seed of David, right? And that of course doesn't go anywhere because they don't know the mythicist arguments. So they don't know that, you know, mythicists have developed like responses to these kinds of points. But unfortunately, this debate is never going to happen because I decided to invest my time into something different, hopefully more entertaining. Okay, well, Pine Creek was going for a while, right? So just rewind or watch it later. I think this was pretty good. Can I just say your video thumbnails are great? I guess I'm a fan of famous painting memes. Also, I love the death of Socrates, so dumb cover. Yeah, I have a rule that I need to, and I will always just make all of my thumbnails in MS Paint, which is, of course, the greatest program ever. I will never teach myself Photoshop or anything like that. And I will never have these like fancy thumbnails with like lasers coming out of people's eyes, like some channels. It's just we are going to go low cost, and I think there's some charm to it. Yeah. Okay. How about something about the other apocalyptic Jewish preachers similar to Jesus that were around in the 3rd century? What do we know about them? That's an amazing suggestion for a topic. Actually, let me write it down right now so that I can show you how dedicated I am to you guys, right? Because I, of course, have a file where I keep these kind of potential topics. So, other says, let's say. Yeah, one of these days, why not? It's going to be interesting for me because I would need to brush up of some of the things. Yeah, and of course, massive shout out to Floyd FP, who has done a lot of work around the Book of Daniel. And you can just, if you Google him and Book of Daniel, for example, I think it was on Dogma Debate, where he gave a presentation about the Book of Daniel and why like normal people think that this was written in the 2nd century. And by the way, when I say normal people, like there are tons of Christians who think that this is written in the 2nd century. Right? Christians recognize this, right? That this is actually not only that this is describing events in the 2nd century, but also that this is being written in the 2nd century. Do you know, for example, who buys it? Open theists, right? Because open theists are essentially cornered into recognizing that the Book of Daniel was written in the second century, because they of course think that God doesn't know the future exhaustively, like he can guess, he can make estimates, and he can most importantly he can say something is going to happen and then make it happen, right? So in some cases where we see God declaring something and that thing happening, it's not because he has like extensive knowledge, exhaustive knowledge, non-generated knowledge of the future. It's because like he himself made sure that's going to happen, right? So that's also okay on open theism. But open theists are also massive libertarians, right? They do subscribe to libertarian free will. So you can't really have God who doesn't know for sure what's going to happen in the future. A God who doesn't violate people's free will, and something like Book of Daniel chapter 11, right? Because you would either have to think that if it was actually written by Daniel, that God knew the entire content of international policy in Syro-Palestine in like 2 centuries in advance. He knew about all of these princesses marrying to kings and assassinations of infant babies and these kind of things in advance, which doesn't really jive with open theism, right? That's like super specific knowledge of the future that you can't just guess, right? You can't continuously keep guessing. Even if you are a really good predictor like God, you can't just continually guessing on open theism correctly, like which king is going to attack which king and when and where and stuff like that. Or alternatively, you can think that this is one of the cases where God actually made the history happen the way how he wanted. So again, if you think that this was actually showed to Daniel as a vision, you would have to believe that God then went on and basically puppeted, orchestrated the events so that this vision plays out. And that's just incompatible with libertarian free will, right? Like God would basically would have to be like a puppet master, and he would essentially have to control, remote control all of these kings and queens and court officials as robots doing his bidding in order to make sure that like every last single event fits into the prophecy. So really, the only thing that you're left with as an open theist, if you even know about this stuff at all, is that yeah, it was actually written in the second century. I actually got in the open theist Facebook group, got a concession acknowledgement from some high profile open theists about this, who are like active on YouTube. I had to explain to them, of course, first what's going on and how this is a problem on open theism, and they like tried some stuff, but they actually conceded then that yeah, this was probably written in the second century. Okay, so is it time for something completely different now? I think so. So let's go for it. So everyone's favorite segment. Well, we just switch the gears and we talk about something completely different. And today it's not going to be super long because I kind of expected the stream to be much longer. But still, I think it's important. So and interesting. So I'm now doing a course on some aspects of early Christian tradition. We are talking about things like monasticism, martyrdom, and stuff like that. And we get to read a lot of really interesting and in some cases obscure um, early Christian sources that you wouldn't normally pick up. Right? It's not your Tertullian or Origen or Eusebius. This is, for example, Palladius. So how many people know about Palladius? Probably not many, right? Even among like interested layperson, let's say, lay people. Like today, for example, and I have to definitely make it. I have to put it into one of these segments. I read a martyrdom account where a guy was essentially raped, right? Like he was tied by ropes, and he was aroused by a hooker who gave him a blowjob, and he was overcome by lust, and they had sex. And that's a martyrdom account. He ended up eventually just biting his own tongue off and spitting it into her own face. But still, this is literally death by snoo. That's That's, for example, found in ancient sources, right? Ancient Christian sources. But this is something different, right? So here we have Palladius, who's writing about early monasticism, and he's actually writing about the very first monk, Christian monk, right? So he says, Tapanesi is a place so-called in the Thebaid, so it's in Upper Egypt around the Egyptian Thebes, in which there lived a certain Pachomius, one of those who have lived in the straight way, so that he was counted worthy both of prophecies and angelic visions. He was exceedingly devoted both to his fellow men and his brethren. Accordingly, to him, as he said in his grave, an angel appeared and said, "You have successfully ordered your own life, so it is superfluous to remain sitting in your cave. Up! Go out and collect all the young monks and dwell with them, and according to the model which I now give you, so legislate for them." And he gave him a brass tablet on which this was inscribed. By the way, this was not the first monk, I misspoke. This was the most monastic order. So that's like an origin story of the first set of rules, essentially, in monasticism that described how, like a monastery, essentially, monastic community should be organized. And of course, it doesn't come from just any source. It comes from an angelic vision, because that's how you justified new legislation in antiquity, right? Like new laws or just existing laws. Their origin was explained through divine revelation. So maybe there was a divine legislator, like a god, who gave people at some point in history these laws, or there was a son of God, like a hero, who established the polis and gave the first law, right? So if we have new laws, we of course need to have a new divine messenger, right? New divine origin. And what I find super hilarious is that here the monastic order, the description, which is what follows, right? It talks about how to organize the monks, what to do, what not to do, is delivered on brass tablet. So Joseph Smith, anyone? Mormonism, anyone? Already in like 4th century, 5th century, right? Yeah, just find it super interesting. Maybe Joseph Smith knew about it. Well, actually, this is not very well known, but Joseph Smith wasn't the first guy to came with the idea that there are these tablets made out of metal that describe history, record history of pre-Columbian people in America who are actually descendants from the Jews, right? It's of course the only religion like that, but that was actually a pretty common idea in antiquity and in 1900s, and there were people running around in America trying to dig up these tablets. So that wasn't anything new, but maybe these people actually were inspired by this account where an angel appears from heaven with important information recorded on a brass tablet. And I'm just wondering if this guy, Pachomius, showed the tablets to anyone. You know, if there were 3 witnesses or 7 witnesses or however many who handled the plates, you know, touched the plates. But then the plates, of course, were taken up to heaven again after they were translated from Reformed Egyptian, right? Yeah. So there you go. I'm sure they were just writing about how they wanted to be martyred. Hey, let me actually go full screen. Consent is very important here on this channel and in general, right? So I think it's really inappropriate to be laughing about a guy who was raped. So like cut the machismo, you know, cut the male chauvinism. Because yeah, it was a rape, right? Like guys can be raped by women. They can have sex against their will. It says that he was eventually overcome by lust, but still, no means no. So it's obviously all kinds of like juvenile humor comes to mind, but massive SJWs here. Okay, so that's it. Thank you guys. I don't have a topic for next week. I think next week is Christmas, right? 23rd. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll put something together. Although I don't know, we will probably be on way to my family then. So if that doesn't work out, then see you on the 30th. Bye. Have a nice Christmas.